I'll be reading from Exodus 2, 1 through 10. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrews' babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she said. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water."
This morning we're going to begin a study of the life of Moses. For many of the older generation, the mere mention of Moses brings to mind a picture of Charlton Heston as he played that leading role in Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments. In that picture, he is strong and handsome and wise. For today's generation, if you mention Moses, their thoughts are more likely tied to the depiction in Disney's The Prince of Egypt, which is an entertaining animated production of the life of Moses. And here he is presented as athletic and quick-witted and fun-loving. Well, as we look at the biblical record, we will discover that neither of these depictions are completely accurate. That Moses was just a real man with real struggles, some of which he did not handle very well. It's the story of a man who, in spite of his shortcomings, was used greatly by God. Now, most of you remember the story of the beginning of the story of Moses, which Cindy read for us, which really started with the story of Joseph. Remember back in the day when there was a severe famine, Jacob and his sons and their families came to Egypt, where Joseph was able to provide for their needs. And so when they arrived in Egypt, we are told in the beginning of chapter 1 of Exodus, verse 5, the descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. So from a small band numbering 70 people, this little band had become a mighty nation, swelling in number to perhaps in excess of 2 million people. And so the new Pharaoh of Egypt began to perceive of the Israelites as a threat. Verse 8 in chapter 1 says, "Then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. Now it's likely that this new king that is referred to here was new in a very significant sense. Perhaps he's represented not only as a new person taking over as the ruler, but very likely a new ruling family. And he feared that the numerical strength of the Israelites was becoming very much of a threat to them, and he began to look for ways to diminish their numbers. He feared that they would become allies with their enemies, and that they would overcome them and eventually leave Egypt and be their enemies. It's interesting that everything that Pharaoh feared did come to pass in spite of all his efforts. So Pharaoh's first plan was to enslave the Israelites and to tighten his control over them. And a large part of that plan included intimidation and oppression, designed to so demoralize the Israelites that they would not even have the strength to resist. And so Pharaoh used a large slave labor force to strengthen his own country. But the more that the people were oppressed, the more they grew. In verse 12, we read, "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites." So the Egyptian response to the continued numerical growth of the Israelites was to increase their workload and to intensify the harassment and the cruelty that was imposed on them by their taskmasters. And they worked them tirelessly. Verse 14 says, "They made their lives bitter with hard labor, in brick and mortar, and in all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly." Now, frustrated by the ineffectiveness of the previous attempts to curtail that rapid growth of the Israelites, their concern now turned to near panic. And so Pharaoh turns to the Hebrew midwives and tells them in verse 15, "The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, 'When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, let her live.'" So according to these instructions, these midwives were told to watch closely as each Hebrew child was born, and if it were a boy, then to just snuff out its life before it could utter its first cry. And then in that case, the midwife could then say to the mother, "Well, I'm sorry, but the child just didn't live." A hideous and dreadful idea. But frankly, it pales in comparison to the modern-day practice of partial birth abortion, but very similar. But Pharaoh's plans came to nothing, for we read in verse 17, "The midwives, however, feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, 'Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?' The midwives answered Pharaoh, 'Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive.' So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So these daring women lived out their faith where God had placed them. And what they did was daring, if not dramatic, and it reveals a faith that would not disobey God. These women found husbands, they married, and they had homes and families of their own. And so whatever the specifics were, it suggested that these women were protected, and they were rewarded by God. And I think it's quite interesting to consider the fact that we don't even know the name of this new Pharaoh, but we do know the name of these two Hebrew midwives. Finally, in complete desperation, Pharaoh commands that all the boy children just be destroyed, as revealed in verse 22. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." So what Pharaoh had previously tried to do in an underhanded manner, he now just openly demanded. The application of these verses to the present American abomination of abortion on demand should be quite obvious. There is a parallel between what happened then and what is happening in our country now. It began with a scorn for those who were a threat to their perceived self-interest. The Egyptians despised the Israelites, who seemed to endanger their position of comfort and prestige, just as many Americans today look at unwanted children as an economic liability and an unwanted burden. So now, having established the circumstances of Moses' birth, I want to now examine about how his parents were able to pass on a heritage of faith to their son. And that's the main thing I want to get across today. I want to share with you 3 principles about faith that we see in this passage and about passing on that heritage of faith. First one is this: faith does not demand that we act foolishly. Look again at the first 2 verses in Exodus 2. "Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months." In this terrible time of human history, a child is born to this godly couple in the tribe of Levi. And when the parents looked at their newborn child, they saw that he was a fine child. Another translation says that he was no ordinary child. Now, rather than to believe that their parents were just impressed with the beauty of this child, I think it just talks about a parent looking at his child. Any parent looking at his newborn child says, "This is a fine child. This is my child. It's not an ordinary kid because it's my kid." And I'm sure that they were convinced that God had a very special purpose for their child. The biblical perspective is that children are from the Lord. Psalm 127 verse 3 says, "Sons are a heritage from the Lord. children a reward from him. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are sons born in one's youth. And the psalmist later in Psalm 139:13 declares that every child is a product of divine creation. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Now, we have often seen depictions of the fear of the parents of Moses upon the birth of Moses. Such may have been true of other Hebrew parents who knew that their boy children would have to be killed, but I don't think we can say that of Moses' parents, whose names were Amram and Jochebed. In fact, in the New Testament, Hebrews 11:23, it kind of lets us in on the secret of how the parents of Moses faced this crisis. We're told in Hebrews 11:23, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. So that verse in Hebrews 11 indicates that Moses' parents had a deep and abiding faith in God. And this verse says that they hid their child because they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, on the surface, you might expect it to say that they hid the child because they were afraid. But to understand it must be remembered that there were 2 threats implied here in the king's command, one against the babies and the other against the parents. If you kill your baby, you will live, but if you don't kill your baby, you risk your own life. In other words, they look at the fear for their own lives and they decide they're not going to give in to that fear. The point is, that is the faith that produced the courage that they had to defy the king. And I might even suggest to you that Moses grew up to be a great man of faith because his father and mother were people of faith. How would you like to try to hide a baby for 3 months? I remember bringing new babies home from the hospital. It seems like they cry for hours at a time. You could hardly conceal them for 3 minutes, let alone 3 months. But while they did risk their lives in saving the baby, they did hide the baby. Some might argue that if the parents of Moses had real faith, that they would not have hid him, but they would have carried around openly. But that would not have been brave. That would have been just plain stupid. Well, how can we apply this to today? Working with AIDS patients is a noble task of risk-taking faith, but wearing rubber gloves while you do so is just faithful wisdom. Following God's call to a foreign field in a third world country takes faith. But having your children receive vaccinations before you go is just faithful wisdom. So to state it rather plainly, God expects you to use your brain. Charles Swindoll says, to walk by faith does not mean that we stop thinking. To trust God does not imply becoming slovenly or lazy or apathetic. What a distortion of biblical faith. You and I need to trust God for our finances, but that is no license to spend foolishly. You and I ought to trust God for safety in the car, but we're not wise to pass in a blind curve. We trust God for our health, but that doesn't mean that we chain smoke, stay up half the night, and subsist on potato chips and Twinkies without consequences. So faith and careful planning go hand in hand. They always have. And that leads to the next principle, which says that faith does not mean that we do not have to plan. Verses 3 and 4 of Exodus 2 say, but when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Now, you might be like myself and thinking about this image and the story that we've all heard about, Moses and the bulrushes for all our lives, as Jochebed, his mother, making her way down to the river and just kind of thrusting the basket onto the current and the basket bobbing up and down the river until it came to rest in some reeds where he was eventually found. But if you look carefully, that's not how it happened. Verse 3 says that she put it among the reeds along the bank of the river. In other words, she carefully positioned the basket precisely where she wanted it. She put the basket in the place where she knew that the princess would come to bathe. She then sent Moses' older sister Miriam to watch, and she no doubt instructed Miriam carefully on what she was to say. And in verse 5 we are told, then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. This was a plan, and the plan went flawlessly. The princess found the baby just as planned. It was a planned surprise discovery. Some people feel that if you really have faith, that you don't need to plan. Just pray and trust God that God will take care of it. And it is true that sometimes God will just take over a situation no matter how much or how well we have planned, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't plan. In April of 1988, the Evening News reported on a photographer who was a skydiver. He had jumped from a plane along with numerous other skydivers and filmed the group as they fell and opened their parachutes. On the film shown on the telecast, as the final skydiver opened his chute, the picture went berserk. The announcer reported that the cameraman had fallen to his death, having jumped out of the plane without his parachute. It wasn't until he reached the absent ripcord that he realized that he was free falling without a parachute. Nothing could save him, for his faith was placed in a parachute that wasn't even buckled on. Planning is a good thing to do, and it doesn't mean that you don't have faith just because you make plans. In fact, that is one way that you demonstrate your faith, if you make your plans according to what you believe that God would have you to do. Of course, you also need to be ready to accept it if God passes over your plans and does his own thing, but that doesn't mean that you don't make plans. Now I want us to consider one more application of passing on a heritage of faith, and that is this: that faith does not happen by accident. Verse 9 of our story continues with, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. And so the princess, without realizing it, hired the baby's own mother to nurse and raise him. Jochebed not only got her child back, but she got the protection of Pharaoh's daughter, and she got paid to raise him. So this cannot be anything but the hand of God. Jochebed had Moses under her care until he was weaned, and beyond that, while he was growing. However long this might have been was long enough for this mother of Moses to firmly lay a foundation of faith in God. Close to 6 million Americans will take a life-changing experience this next year. They will have children. And how they raise these children will have a greater impact on our society than anything else that they do in life. I want to commend all you moms out there who have decided to remain at home with your preschool children. Now, I'm not talking about single moms who have to work or with mothers who have older children in school, but for parents with little ones at home, it is so important for those kids to have a parent at home with them. Any sacrifice short of food to eat and a place to live is not too great to have this opportunity to be with your children. Think about what would you do if you knew that everything that your child might know about God, they would learn from you. What if this was compounded by the knowledge that in all likelihood you would not have very much time to accomplish this? What would you do? What would you tell your child about? How will they know what the commandments of God are if you don't tell them? The words of Deuteronomy 6:7 would take on special meaning, which says, impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit down at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. You should look for opportunities to tell your children about your faith. That's what Jochebed had to do in the limited time that she had, and that's what all of us should do in the time that we have. So how do you pass on your faith to your children? The words of Proverbs 22:6 offer instruction. It says, train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. What do those words mean? Well, the first word in the verse is train, and it comes from a Hebrew word that is used to describe the actions of the midwife, coincidentally. After the midwife would help deliver a child, she would dip her finger in crushed dates and reach into the mouth of the infant and massage his gums. That flavor sensation would then create a desire to nurse in the infant. And so that term train literally means to create a thirst in. In that brief time that Jochebed had with Moses, she created in him a desire for the things of God that he never got over. Nobody takes the place of a preschooler's mother. So parents, the best thing that you can do is to give your children this desire, this thirst for the Lord. It's not possessions. It's not even education, but it's faith. A faith that leads them to thirst for their God-given gifts that God wants them to use and the abilities to accomplish God's purposes for his kingdom. Of the many things that there are to learn from the life of Moses, which we will be discovering in the weeks ahead, the first thing that we see here is just the simple truth from the story of Moses' infancy is the importance of passing on a heritage of faith. We all have a part in doing that, not only in our own biological families, but in our church family, as we contribute to the lives of our church children and build for them a foundation of Christian memories and doctrines of Christian truth. If you don't have that heritage, or if you have not followed that heritage, you can begin today by stepping into the Christian faith and receiving Jesus Christ as your own personal Lord and Savior, and to commit to him to do all that you can to pass on that heritage of faith to your family, to your loved ones. So as we close our service today, I'd like to make an invitation to anyone who would like to receive Christ as their own personal Lord and Savior, or anyone who has already done that but would like to become a member of our church. You're invited to come forward as we sing a closing hymn. The hymn is found in number 570, Happy the Home When God is There. Let's stand together as we sing.